Have you ever been alone in a room with the dead and suddenly felt like you weren't actually alone? In my 20 years as a mortician, I've seen things most people couldn't imagine. But one night, one body, left me shaken in a way I'll never forget. My name is Edgar Hale, and I've worked as a funeral director and embalmer for most of my adult life. Death doesn't scare me anymore, but that night in the prep room still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. Subscribe before we begin. Trust me, you won't want to watch this one alone. It was late autumn, one of those nights where the cold doesn't just sting your skin. It settles deep into your bones and lingers there, making you feel older, heavier, slower. The air outside the funeral home carried that brittle edge of frost, the kind that fogs the windows and makes the whole world look muted under a thin glaze of ice. Most people were home at that hour, tucked under blankets, televisions humming softly in their living rooms. But not me. My night was just beginning. The funeral home was quiet, too quiet if I'm being honest. Silence in that building has a particular texture to it. It's not the silence of a library or a church or even a hospital. It's thicker, more absolute, almost like the walls themselves are holding their breath. When you're alone there, especially at night, you start to hear things that aren't really there. Your own footsteps sound louder. The hum of the refrigeration units in the prep room becomes an eerie drone, and every shift of the building feels amplified. That night, I was the only one left inside. My assistant, a young man just starting out in this line of work, had left hours earlier. He hated staying after dark. He'd never admit it out loud, but I could see it in the way he avoided looking directly at the covered bodies, or how he rushed through his clean-up tasks if the sun had already gone down. I let him leave early. It was better that way. This line of work demands a certain constitution, and not everyone has it. The day had been busy. Phone calls, arrangements, paperwork, the endless stream of grieving families who all need compassion, guidance, and patience. By the time evening rolled around, I finally had a moment to focus on the body that had come in earlier that afternoon. The man's name, I'll leave that out of respect, but he was in his late 40s. A heart attack, sudden and merciless, had taken him at home. His wife had been the one to find him, slumped over in his favorite armchair. From what I gathered, he had no long history of illness, no warnings. One moment he was alive, and the next, silence. That's the cruel thing about sudden deaths. The people left behind never get the chance to prepare, to say goodbye. His wife's voice on the phone cracked when she told me he was just here, and then he wasn't. There was no police involvement, no suspicion of foul play, just tragedy in its rawest, most mundane form. The coroner signed off quickly, and the body was released to us with little ceremony. His family had requested a private viewing the next morning. That meant I had to prepare him overnight, ensuring he looked peaceful, presentable, like the man they remembered, not the man death had claimed. Normally this sort of case doesn't unsettle me. It's routine. I've worked with bodies in far worse states, accidents, suicides, violent crimes. Compared to that, a sudden heart attack is clean, straightforward, predictable. I told myself it would be a simple process, one I could finish before midnight. Then I could go home, rest, and be ready to receive his grieving family the next day. The preparation room where I'd be working was in the back of the building. Getting there always felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The front of the funeral home is built for the living. Polished floors, soft lighting, furniture arranged for comfort. It's where families gather, cry, pray, and cling to each other. But the prep room, that's different. It's a space designed purely for function, not comfort. Stainless steel tables, cabinets stocked with instruments and chemicals. The low, constant hum of refrigeration units along one wall, bright fluorescent lights that wash everything in a sterile, almost unnatural glow. That night, as I unlocked the prep room and switched on the lights, the brightness almost hurt my eyes. After hours of sitting in the dim office, the sudden white glare was jarring. The metal of the embalming table gleamed, cold and indifferent. In one corner, the instruments lay in neat rows: scalpels, forceps, sutures, needles, trocars, all familiar to me, tools of a trade most people would rather not think about. To me, they were extensions of my hands, each one holding a purpose, each one part of the ritual of restoring dignity to the dead. The body was already inside, zipped up in a black vinyl bag. There's a sound that body bags make when you touch them, a kind of crinkling, a stiffness that never fails to remind you what's inside. I wheeled him to the center of the room, the casters squeaking faintly against the tile. For a moment I just stood there, my hand on the zipper, breathing slowly. This is something I've done thousands of times, but every time there's that instant of hesitation. That half-second where I wonder irrationally what I'm about to see. The file said heart attack, nothing unusual. But still, when you're alone in a room like that, late at night, the imagination has a way of clawing through even the calmest mind. I unzipped the bag slowly. The smell was faint, clinical, not yet strong with the chemical tang of embalming fluids. He looked ordinary. A man who had been alive just a day earlier, now reduced to stillness. His face was pale, slack, his lips tinged blue from the lack of circulation. His eyes, though, were open, wide open. That detail made me pause. It wasn't rare, exactly. Eyes don't always close neatly when death comes. Sometimes they're half-lidded, sometimes shut completely, sometimes staring. But these eyes, his eyes, looked frozen in shock, as if the last thing he saw had terrified him beyond words. His jaw was clenched tight, his teeth locked together. His expression was not peaceful. It was strained, unnatural, resistant. I told myself not to dwell on it. Death is never flattering, and the job of a mortician is to soften those sharp, unsettling details. That's what the family comes to us for, to see their loved one not as death left them, but as life remembered them. So I set to work. The process is methodical. It demands precision, patience, and respect. Normally, my mind slips into a steady rhythm, task after task, step after step. But that night, something felt off. The silence seemed heavier than usual, pressing in on me. My own movements sounded exaggerated, like every drawer I opened, every tool I picked up, echoed unnaturally loud in the room. I reminded myself of the schedule. The family was coming at 9 sharp. They wanted him dressed in his navy suit, the one his wife had carefully chosen. I'd seen it earlier, folded neatly in a garment bag, laid out by the family when they brought it in. The small details stuck with me. The tie was slightly worn, like he'd used it often, and the jacket smelled faintly of cologne. His wife must have pressed it before bringing it in. The creases were sharp, intentional. You could feel the love behind that choice, the desperate attempt to cling to normalcy in a moment of unimaginable loss. That's what weighed on me most. Every body on my table is more than just flesh. They're memories, lives, stories cut short, and my job is to hold all of that in my hands, if only for a few hours. I told myself this would be routine, quiet, predictable. But even as I thought it, even as I prepared the tools and checked the notes, there was a small, persistent knot in my stomach that told me I was wrong. Something about this man, his expression, the timing, the air in the room, felt different. And before the night was over, I would find out just how wrong I was. At first, all I saw was fabric, white shroud cloth covering the man's body, folded neatly by the attendants who'd brought him in. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the vinyl, sterile and bright. But as I pulled the cloth back, his face came into view, and that's when I noticed it. His eyes, open wide, staring at nothing. Now I need you to understand, this isn't inherently shocking in my profession. The dead don't always close their eyes like in the movies. Often they remain partially open, a blank gaze upward. Sometimes they even dry out, the lids curling slightly, giving the appearance of a strange half-smile. I've seen it all. But this was different. His eyes weren't just open, they were locked, wide, unblinking, frozen in an expression I can only describe as terror. It wasn't the emptiness I was used to. There was something lingering in those pupils, something that suggested his last moments hadn't been peaceful at all. It was as though whatever he had seen in the instant before death had branded itself into his features, refusing to let go. And then there was his jaw, clenched, tight, so tight that when I tried the usual technique, gently pressing the chin downward to loosen the mouth, I felt immediate resistance, rigid, stubborn, like his muscles hadn't gotten the message that life was over. It was as if the man himself was resisting me, clinging to that final grimace of fear. At first, I tried to rationalize. Rigor mortis, I told myself. Rigor comes in stages, usually beginning a few hours after death, starting in the smaller muscles like the jaw and eyelids before spreading to the larger groups. By the time I received him, rigor should have been well underway. That explained the tightness, that explained the resistance. But here's the thing, rigor mortis passes. It locks the body, yes, but it eventually releases. And even at its stiffest, I've always been able to set the features of a face with the right techniques, massaging the muscles, using small tools, applying pressure in just the right places. It can be difficult, but it's never impossible. This was different. It felt less like stiffness and more like defiance. I remember leaning over him, my gloved hands on either side of his jaw, trying gently to maneuver it into place. The sensation was unnatural. It was like trying to pry open a locked box. No matter how much pressure I applied, no matter what angle I tried, the jaw would not yield. His teeth were clamped shut with an intensity that didn't make sense. A bead of sweat slid down my forehead, even though the room was cool. My breathing had grown shallow, my movements slower, more cautious. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought whispered, "He doesn't want you to touch him." I shook it off. Superstitious nonsense. I'm a man of science, of process, of ritual, yes, but not superstition. Bodies don't resist. They don't refuse. They don't want anything. Still, I couldn't deny the feeling crawling across my skin. I paused, stepping back from the table, studying his face under the harsh fluorescent lights. His expression hadn't softened. Those eyes still stared, wide and unblinking, the jaw still locked, the whole face twisted into something that looked like a silent scream. And I swear to you, the longer I looked, the less lifeless he seemed. His skin, though pale, still had a strange vibrancy, as though the blood had only just drained away. The muscles of his face seemed taut, strained, like someone holding a breath too long. It was a corpse, yes, but one that felt caught in transition, like the moment of death hadn't fully ended. I tried again. More force this time. I pressed my thumb against his chin, using leverage to apply steady downward pressure. Nothing. The jaw was unmovable. I reached for a tool, a small mouth prop used to hold the jaw open during embalming. Even that, a device designed to do this exact job, couldn't find purchase. His teeth remained locked, as though fused together. My frustration began to mingle with unease. I've worked on victims of car crashes whose bones were shattered into unrecognizable fragments. I've prepared suicides, overdoses, drownings, bodies burned beyond easy recognition. I've seen jaws slack, jaws broken, jaws so distorted they seem to belong to something non-human. But never, not once, had I seen a jaw that simply refused. At that moment, a memory surfaced, an old embalmer I apprenticed under decades ago. He once told me, "Watch the jaw. If a man dies afraid, sometimes his fear lingers there." At the time, I dismissed it as morbid folklore, the kind of thing old men in this profession say to unsettle rookies. But standing in that room, facing this man's locked expression of horror, I couldn't help but hear his words echoing. I decided to step away for a moment, give myself distance. I placed the tools neatly back on the tray, wiped my gloves clean, and turned toward the sink. I let the cold water run, splashing some onto my wrists. The chill grounded me, reminding me of where I was, what I was doing. This was science, not superstition. I told myself that over and over. Science, not superstition. But the room didn't feel convinced. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if it clung to me. The hum of the refrigeration units in the corner had grown louder, a droning vibration that seemed to burrow into my skull. I glanced back at the table. He hadn't moved. Of course he hadn't. But there was something about the angle of his head now, the way the light cast shadows across his face, that made him look different. More alive, less like a body, more like a man watching me. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and when I opened them again, the illusion was gone. Still, I couldn't shake it. That sense of resistance, of defiance, of being confronted not by a corpse, but by the final, unyielding fragment of a man's terror. I stepped closer again, determined to finish the task. I whispered, not out of ritual, but out of instinct. "It's all right. I'll take care of you. Just let go." And as ridiculous as it sounds, in that moment I almost expected him to answer. He didn't, of course. Silence. But the silence was heavier now, and the weight of his gaze, those wide, lifeless eyes, pressed down on me like a physical force. That was when I knew this would not be routine, this would not be quiet, this would not be predictable. This was the beginning of something I still struggle to explain. I froze. For a long moment I didn't even breathe. The sound had been sharp, clean, undeniable. A single knock, not the creak of the building settling, not the scrape of a shoe against tile, not the metallic groan of refrigeration units cycling on. This was different, this was deliberate, and it came from inside the prep room. My first instinct was denial. Buildings make sounds, I reminded myself. Pipes expand and contract, walls shift, machinery hums and clicks. I'd spent enough nights alone here to know every groan, every sigh of the old funeral home. But this wasn't like any of those. It had the clarity of intention. Someone or something had wanted to be heard. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, and turned slowly back toward the body. He hadn't moved. Of course he hadn't. He lay there exactly as I'd left him, eyes wide, jaw clenched, face twisted in that terrible expression. But still. The knock lingered in the air, like an echo inside my skull. I needed to ground myself. Procedure always grounds me. When things feel strange, you return to the paperwork. The file never lies. So I reached for the man's chart again, flipping it open with hands that trembled slightly inside my gloves. Cause of death. Cardiac arrest, autopsy not required, notes from coroner, natural causes, no trauma. Everything lined up. The facts were clear, neat and unremarkable. On paper, this was one of the simplest cases I could ask for, and yet nothing about it felt simple. I set the folder down carefully, forcing myself to take a breath. My training whispered in my ear, "Control the environment, control yourself." I leaned over the man again, tried once more to manipulate his jaw. This time I whispered to him, my voice so soft I barely heard it myself. "It's all right," I said. "Just let me help you. Let me do my job." It sounds strange, I know, talking to the dead, but you'd be surprised how many morticians do it. It's not about expecting a reply, it's about respect, about acknowledging that this was once a person, not just a shell. And sometimes, in the quiet, it feels less like you're speaking to them and more like you're speaking to yourself, reassuring your own trembling hands. But my words had no effect. His mouth refused to close, his jaw stubborn as iron. The expression of terror clung to him as tightly as rigor itself. That's when I decided to step away. I needed different tools, something stronger, something designed for resistance. The mouth prop hadn't worked, but there were other options. The storage cabinet against the wall held an array of instruments, and I told myself if I just equipped myself properly, this obstacle would be nothing more than muscle stiffness. So I turned, walked the few steps across the tile floor toward the cabinets. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness. I opened the drawer, the metal handle cool under my gloves, and began selecting the tools. And then it came, that sound. A sharp knock, not from the hall outside, not from above or below, from inside the prep room. It was singular, final, like the knuckle of a hand striking wood or metal, intentional, direct, impossible to mistake. I froze again, half-crouched with a tool in my hand, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. My ears strained, waiting for a second knock, a shuffle, any sound to confirm what I'd heard. But nothing came, only silence, so heavy it pressed against me like a weight. My chest tightened. I turned my head slowly, eyes scanning the room. The refrigeration units hummed steadily in their corner. The stainless steel table gleamed under the harsh light. The instruments I'd laid out earlier still rested on the tray, undisturbed. And the body lay exactly as it had before, still silent, unyielding. Yet every instinct screamed that I was not alone. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a tool had fallen, maybe the air ducts had shifted, maybe one of the refrigeration compressors had clicked unusually. But even as the explanations formed in my mind, I knew none of them fit. The sound I'd heard was a knock, a purposeful sound. I placed the tool I'd grabbed back in the drawer, closed it softly, and straightened. My eyes darted to the walls, the ceiling, the door. I took a few slow steps, listening. First, I checked the prep room door. It was closed as I'd left it. The hallway outside was dark, silent. No one had entered. I knew that with certainty my office was near the entrance, and I'd have heard anyone coming in. Besides, the building was locked for the night. Next, I checked the refrigeration units. I ran my hand across the metal doors, pressing my ear against them. The hum of the machinery was steady, consistent. Nothing unusual. No loose panels, no rattling pipes. Then I circled the room itself, tapped on the walls, the counters, even the cabinets, hollow echoes, nothing resembling the sharpness of the knock I'd heard. Everywhere I looked, everything was as it should be, and yet the memory of that sound remained vivid in my mind. Finally, I turned back toward the table, and that's when I realized something had changed. Subtle. Almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once I saw it. The man's expression, his mouth, though still clenched, seemed different. The corners of his lips, ever so slightly, had shifted. The wide stare of his eyes seemed sharper now, as though they had locked onto me with renewed intensity. It was impossible, of course. Impossible. But I felt it all the same. A chill ran the length of my spine, prickling my skin beneath my clothes. The air in the room felt colder now, biting, though I knew the thermostat hadn't changed. My hands trembled against my will. This was the moment, I think, where my rational mind began to fracture. Part of me screamed, "It's rigor mortis, it's lighting, it's your imagination." Another part whispered, "No, something else is here. Something is watching you." The knock had been the first intrusion. The shift in his expression was the second, and I knew with a sinking certainty that this night was only beginning. At first, I told myself it was nothing, a creak, a trick of the ear. Old buildings breathe, I reminded myself, and I'd heard 1,000 strange noises echo through these walls in the dead of night. But when I returned to the table, I stopped dead in my tracks. The stainless steel instruments I had laid out earlier were no longer in their neat, methodical row. They were scattered, not just shifted slightly, as if I'd bumped the tray. No, they were spread wide across the surface, some clattering near the edge, others lying crooked, their sharp points catching the harsh fluorescent light. It was as though someone had taken their hand and deliberately swiped across the table, scattering everything in one violent motion. The sight rooted me where I stood, my breath caught in my throat. I replayed my memory, desperate for a rational explanation. I had set those tools down carefully, lined them up out of habit. Forceps, scalpel, scissors, suture needles, all perfectly aligned. That's how I work. That's how I've always worked. Could I have left them like this without realizing? No, impossible. Could a vibration from the refrigeration units have shifted them? No, they were too far apart, spread in different directions. The silence of the room pressed against me, thick, suffocating. The scattered instruments seemed to mock me, gleaming under the cold light like teeth bared in a grin. I stepped closer, slowly, each footfall echoing like thunder in my ears. I reached out with a gloved hand, trembling slightly, and touched the scalpel. The metal was cool, too cool, as if it had been resting in ice rather than on a sterile tray. I slid it back into place, my movements mechanical, forcing order back into the chaos. One by one, I straightened the instruments, but my eyes kept drifting back to the table behind me. The body. When I finally looked, my stomach dropped, his jaw no longer clenched, no longer locked in that rigid, impossible resistance. Now it hung open, wide, slack, as though he had been screaming and was suddenly cut off mid-breath. I froze, staring. My mind rebelled instantly. This was impossible. I'd spent nearly half an hour wrestling with that jaw, applying pressure, using tools, whispering coaxing words. Nothing worked. Nothing had budged it. And yet now, here it was, hanging loose, effortless, as though it had never been clenched at all. I took an involuntary step backward, my body colliding with the counter behind me, rattling the drawers. A sharp clang rang out as one of the instruments I had just straightened rolled off the tray and struck the floor. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. My chest tightened, breath shallow, heart pounding against my ribs like a frantic drum. This was not possible. This was not normal. I leaned closer, squinting, my hands trembling despite the latex gloves clinging to my skin. The jaw was undeniably open, the teeth visible, slightly parted, the tongue resting slack inside. The expression was no longer one of terror frozen in defiance. It was something worse. It looked like surrender. But how? Had rigor mortis released in the span of minutes? Impossible. Not like this. Not so sudden, not so complete. Rigor fades gradually, over hours, not all at once. The transformation before me defied everything I knew, everything I'd studied, everything my years in this profession had taught me. A memory flickered unbidden in my mind. Stories I'd heard whispered among older morticians, the kind they only tell late at night when the bourbon is flowing and the lights are low. Stories of bodies that moved on their own, of expressions shifting when no one was watching, of whispers in the embalming room. I had always dismissed them as superstition, the product of long hours, fatigue, and the human mind's need to make sense of grief and silence. But now, standing here, staring into the gaping mouth of a man I could not control, surrounded by instruments that had been scattered as if by an unseen hand, I wasn't so sure anymore. The air pressed down heavier than before, thick in my lungs, almost suffocating. Each breath felt like inhaling through wet cloth. My skin prickled with gooseflesh, despite the steady temperature of the room. The hum of the refrigeration units grew louder, droning, vibrating against my skull. I forced myself to step forward again, closer to the table. My instincts screamed against it, every muscle in my body tense, ready to flee. But my training, my professionalism, my pride demanded I confront what I was seeing. I leaned in, eyes locked on his face. The wide stare of his eyes had not softened. They remained unblinking, glassy, fixed on nothing, and yet they seemed to follow me, tracking my movements with silent accusation. The open mouth, dark and hollow, seemed to pull at the air, like a word was hanging there, unspoken, waiting. I whispered again, though I didn't know why. "Why won't you let me help you?" Silence answered, but it was a silence that felt charged. And then, faintly, I noticed something else. A smell. At first, I thought it was the usual chemical tang of the room. The faint antiseptic odor of disinfectants, the metallic edge of instruments sterilized in solution. But this was different, sharper, acrid, almost like the air after a lightning strike, ozone, thick and unnatural. It lingered near the body, clinging to him like a shroud. My throat tightened as I inhaled. The smell carried with it something primal, something that made my instincts flare in warning. This was not a scent that belonged here. I staggered back again, putting distance between myself and the body, my gloves trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter for support. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could explain this. But the truth pressed in on me, undeniable. The tools, the air, the smell, the jaw. Something had changed, something was wrong, and I was no longer convinced I was alone in that room. Now I know what skeptics will say. I've heard the arguments 100 times, even made them myself when younger and greener in this profession. Bodies twitch, muscles release, nerves fire. And yes, there's truth in all of that. Death doesn't silence the body instantly. There's a kind of afterlife in the flesh itself. Cells keep working, muscles contract, gases build and shift. Sometimes a hand will jerk, a finger will curl, an eyelid will flutter. I've even seen what looked like a body sit up, but it was nothing supernatural. Just gases forcing the torso into motion, a grotesque trick of decomposition. So yes, skeptics would tell me jaw muscles relax, eyelids stiffen, gases cause bloating. This is biology, this is chemistry, this is physics, nothing more. But here's the thing. Science explains a lot, but not everything. And science does not explain what I saw that night. Because instruments don't scatter themselves across a sterile table. Stainless steel does not leap and clatter without cause. And the face that stared back at me, that wide-eyed, mouth-gaping mask of terror, that was not random relaxation. That was an expression, an intentional one, a scream frozen in time. When I first started in this field, an old coroner I trained under gave me a piece of advice. Learn the science, but never forget the stories. Both will keep you alive in this work. I laughed at the time, thinking it was just a poetic way of making death sound mysterious. But over the years, I've come to understand what he meant. The science is clear. Death follows rules. The body is a machine, and once it stops, it decays in a predictable sequence. Algor mortis, rigor mortis, livor mortis, decomposition. These are constants, measurable and repeatable. I've relied on them countless times. But then, there are the stories. I've heard morticians talk about voices in the prep room, about cold hands brushing their shoulders when no one was there. I've heard embalmers swear they saw a face change when their back was turned, eyes closing or opening with no explanation. Most laugh it off, share it over drinks, brush it away as fatigue or overwork. Still, some speak with a seriousness that lingers. One embalmer I knew, 30 years in the field, once told me he quit after a case where the body kept bleeding, hours after embalming fluid had been pumped in. He said no matter how many times he reinserted the trocar, no matter how he adjusted the pressure, blood continued to seep as though the body was fighting against being preserved. It was like he didn't want to be embalmed, he whispered. His hands trembled as he told me, even after retirement. Another story came from a colleague in a small-town funeral home. He said he walked into the prep room one morning to find every drawer in the cabinets standing wide open, every instrument scattered across the floor. The body he'd been working on the night before was lying there with a different expression, smiling faintly. He moved across the country not long after. Of course, skeptics have their explanations. Fatigue, stress, the mind playing tricks in an environment that already unnerves the senses. Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations. Shadows and reflections can be deceiving. And grief, constant exposure to grief, has a way of reshaping the way you perceive the world. And maybe they're right. Maybe the scattered instruments that night were the result of my own carelessness. Maybe the shift in his expression was just lighting, or rigor mortis releasing more quickly than usual. Maybe the sharp knock I heard earlier was a pipe in the walls. But if that were true, then why did the room feel like it was watching me? Why did the air itself seem to thicken, pressing against my chest, making every breath a struggle? Why did his face, not relaxed, not slack, but stretched into terror, look less like biology and more like communication? I've asked myself these questions for years. I've even asked colleagues. Some laugh, some shake their heads, some lean in and whisper stories of their own. And that's when I realized something important. Everyone in this profession has a story they don't talk about, a night they can't explain, a memory that gnaws at them in silence. For some, it's dismissed as exhaustion. For others, it's filed away as trauma. But for a few, for those who admit it out loud, it's something else entirely, something darker. There's a quiet war in this line of work between the scientists and the storytellers. The scientists insist there's always an answer, even if we don't see it yet. The storytellers, the old guard, the ones who've seen too much, whisper that sometimes the dead refuse the rules. And me, that night in that prep room, staring into the face of a man whose scream had outlived his heartbeat, I felt torn between the two. My training told me one thing. My eyes, my skin, my trembling hands told me another. In 20 years of death care, I've learned this much. Science can explain almost everything, almost. But not that night. Not him. Not the sound of instruments scattering when no one touched them. Not the sudden release of a jaw locked tighter than steel. Not the weight of a silence that felt alive. If you ask me now, even all these years later, I'll tell you the truth I can't deny. That was no muscle spasm. That was no gas release. That was no coincidence. That was something else, something outside of science, something that looked at me through the eyes of a dead man and reminded me not everything stays buried. I bent closer, forcing my hands to move faster, even though every muscle in my body screamed at me to stop. The sooner I finished, the sooner I could leave this room behind. That's when it happened. The lights flickered, just once. But in that half-second of darkness, I swear to you, I saw something. It wasn't my reflection. It wasn't the shadow of a table or the flicker of my own movement. I know what I saw. A figure. A shadow. Not mine. Not cast from anything in the room. It was standing over the table, leaning close, hovering over his body as though examining him or protecting him. And though it lasted no more than the blink of an eye, the image burned itself into my vision. Tall, bent, its outline jagged, wrong, like smoke trying to hold shape. When the light steadied, it was gone. But the room had changed. The air itself was different, denser, heavier, carrying a sharp tang that stung my nose and throat. The smell was metallic, biting, ozone, like the aftermath of a lightning strike, only stronger, mixed with the faint copper scent of blood. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The prep room was silent, too silent, as if the electricity itself was holding its breath. I wanted to run. Every instinct told me to turn, to fling open the door, to leave the body unfinished and never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the same unseen force that had scattered my tools, that had pried open his jaw, was holding me in place. And then slowly I heard it. A sound I will never forget, a breath. Not mine, not the quiet hum of machines, not the shifting groan of the building. A breath, shallow, wet, pulling at the air, coming from the table, coming from him. My stomach dropped into ice. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. He was dead, hours dead. I'd checked for vitals. He was prepped, paperwork complete. But I heard it again. A faint, rattling inhale, followed by an almost imperceptible exhale. I leaned closer, against my better judgment, against every instinct, because I had to know. His chest didn't move. His body was still, and yet the sound was real. I stood inches from his open mouth, staring into that cavern of darkness, and the breath came again, brushing across my face, cold, moist, carrying with it that same metallic tang. I stumbled back, hand flying to my mask, my stomach twisting. My gloves trembled as I fumbled for the scalpel, not to use it, but to hold it. A pathetic defense against whatever this was. The lights flickered again, this time longer. The room plunged into darkness for what felt like a full second, maybe two. And in that darkness, I wasn't alone. I felt it. The presence, the weight of something vast and cold leaning in around me, pressing into my skin, my bones, and then, when the lights snapped back on, my heart nearly stopped. His face had changed. The wide, open mouth I had seen moments before was different now, stretched further, impossibly further, the lips curled back to reveal gums, teeth, and darkness beyond. His eyes, though lifeless, seemed to bulge wider, glassier, as if straining to see me. And the expression, God, the expression, it was no longer just terror, it was hunger. My knees went weak, my vision tunneling. The room seemed to tilt, the fluorescent lights above buzzing louder, dimming at the edges. I staggered back into the counter, instruments clattering to the floor in a cacophony of metal on tile. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a flicker, a shape at the corner of the room. I turned my head, but it was gone. I whipped back to the table, breath ragged, and felt my blood run cold. The body had shifted. Not much, just a fraction. But enough. His hand, which had been lying limp at his side, was now closer to the edge of the table. Just slightly, just enough to notice. I told myself I was hallucinating, that stress, exhaustion, fear were twisting my perception. But then the breath came again, louder this time, closer, and for the first time in my career I whispered, not to the body, but to whatever else was there. "What do you want?" Silence. And then the lights went out completely. Not a flicker, not a dim. Out. Pitch black. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The hum of the refrigeration units died with the light. The room was silent, suffocating, and in that silence, in that darkness, the breathing was all I heard. Not one set, two, one ragged and wet, rising from the body. The other, slow, deliberate, just behind me, too close. So close I could feel it on the back of my neck. I forced myself to finish. Every second that followed felt like an eternity. My hands worked mechanically, as though they no longer belonged to me, moving out of habit, driven by years of repetition rather than conscious thought. Set the features, adjust the eyelids, smooth the skin, comb the hair. I worked in silence, every muscle tense, waiting for another flicker, another sound, another breath. But none came. The lights stayed steady. The hum of the refrigeration units resumed as though nothing had interrupted them. The instruments stayed where I placed them. The shadow did not return. Only the smell lingered, that sharp, metallic tang, impossible to mistake. It clung to the air, to my gloves, to my mask. I tried to ignore it, but it crawled into my lungs with every breath, branding itself into memory. By the time I finished, dawn had crept through the blinds. Thin, pale light replaced the sterile glow of fluorescence. I cleaned the room methodically, restoring order where chaos had reigned hours before. The counters gleamed, the instruments shone, lined neatly once again. The floor was spotless. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. By morning, the family arrived. They moved with that slow, hollow weight of grief, their faces drawn, their voices hushed. I led them into the viewing room, trying to keep my expression calm, neutral, professional, though inside I was still shaking. And when they saw him, they wept, not out of fear, not out of horror, but relief. To them, he looked peaceful. His eyes were closed. His jaw was set softly. His features, once locked in that mask of terror, now carried the illusion of rest. To their eyes, He looked as though he had simply drifted off in sleep. They touched his hands. They whispered their goodbyes. They wept against his still chest. And in that moment, I envied them, because what they saw was not what I had seen. They would never know the truth, the wide, staring eyes, the jaw torn open as though in an endless scream. They would never know about the shadow, the flickering lights, the breath that chilled me to the marrow. And that was for the best, because what haunted me from that night forward wasn't just what I saw. It was what I felt. That presence, that suffocating weight pressing down on me in the darkness, that sense of being watched, examined, measured by something that didn't belong in this world. Even after they left, after the viewing room fell silent again, I couldn't shake it. I walked the halls of the funeral home, switching on every light, checking every corner. The building felt different now. Unclean somehow, not in sight or smell, but in spirit. And yet when I returned to the prep room, there was nothing. No scattered instruments, no flickering lights, no trace of what had unfolded. The room was spotless, ordinary, unremarkable, as though the night had never happened. That was the cruelest part of all. There was no proof. No evidence, nothing to point to, nothing to explain, just my own trembling memory. To anyone else, it was a quiet autumn night, another routine preparation, another grieving family comforted. But to me, it was the night I realized some things do not stay buried. The weeks that followed were the hardest. I found myself avoiding the prep room after dark. If I had to work late, I kept the radio on full blast, filling the silence with static and old music. Still, every so often, the lights would flicker. Not enough to call attention, just enough to make my stomach tighten. And the smell. God, the smell. Every now and then I'd catch the faintest trace of ozone, sharp and metallic, lingering in the corners of the room. I told myself it was in my head, that my mind was replaying what had happened, layering phantoms over ordinary life. But deep down, I knew better. Some nights, even years later, I still wake with the memory, the darkness, the breath, that impossible shadow leaning over him. And always, always the face of a man whose scream outlived his heart. To this day, I still don't have an answer. Was it exhaustion? A trick of the mind, sharpened by long hours and heavy silence? Was my brain strained under fluorescent lights and the stench of chemicals, inventing shadows and breaths where none existed? Or did I witness something the living aren't supposed to see? I replay the details endlessly, looking for cracks, for rational explanations. The flickering lights could have been faulty wiring. The smell, maybe an odd mixture of disinfectant and decay. The scattered instruments, a clumsy mistake, one I refuse to admit even to myself. But the face, that's what I can't explain away. The way his expression changed, the way his jaw, locked tight with rigor, suddenly opened into something far worse. The wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to follow me, accusing, pleading, warning. And the breath, that shallow, wet inhale and exhale brushing against my cheek, cold and real. No matter how I twist it, no matter how I rationalize, that memory refuses to soften into science. It remains raw, jagged, undeniable. So I wonder, was his terror at the moment of death so strong that it clung to his body, etched into his features like a scar that refused to fade? Can fear itself linger, burning so deeply into the soul that even death doesn't erase it? I've handled thousands of bodies in my career. Most look peaceful, as if sleep has simply carried them away. Some look surprised, some look pained, but he looked hunted. And if terror can cling to a body like that, if it can cross the boundary between life and death, then what does that mean for the rest of us? What do we leave behind when we go? Science says nothing. The body shuts down, brain activity ceases, muscles relax. That's the end. But belief says something different. Some believe the soul lingers until it's at rest, until unfinished business is resolved. Some say the dead don't always know they're gone. Some whisper about death echoes, moments of trauma so powerful they replay themselves again and again, trapped in the flesh, the air, the walls of a room. I used to dismiss all of that as superstition. I used to believe that once the heart stopped, the story ended. But that night made me question, what if the story doesn't end? What if the terror we carry in our last moments doesn't fade with our final breath, but waits, imprinted in the body or worse, in the spaces around it? And if that's true, how many screams are still echoing in the silence of funeral homes, hospitals, morgues? How many shadows linger just beyond the edge of sight, watching, waiting, replaying the last seconds of their lives over and over? Sometimes I think about his family, about the way they wept with relief, believing he looked peaceful. I could never tell them what I saw. To them, he left this world quietly. But I know the truth. He didn't. He fought. He feared. And maybe he's still fighting. There are nights when I sit alone in the dark, and I catch myself listening, waiting for the faintest trace of a breath that shouldn't be there. And in those moments, I wonder, did I witness something from him? Or did something else step into that room, using his body as a mask? Was it his fear made manifest? Or was it something older, something darker, drawn to the energy of his death, feeding on it, showing itself to me just long enough to remind me that science doesn't hold all the answers? I don't know. And maybe I'll never know. But I do know this. Not everything that happens in death care can be explained away. For all the textbooks, all the anatomy, all the biology and chemistry, there are nights when the rules are broken, nights when the veil feels too thin, nights when the dead don't stay silent. And this was one of those nights, the night that reminded me that terror doesn't always die with the body. Sometimes it lingers, sometimes it breathes, sometimes it watches, and sometimes it chooses you to see it. I've embalmed thousands of people. I've worked more late nights than I can count. I've stood in silence with the dead, listened to their families grieve, carried the weight of their last expressions into my dreams. But that night was different. That night in the small hours before dawn, I wasn't just a mortician preparing a body. I was a witness to something I still can't explain, something that looked at me through the eyes of a man long gone, something that breathed in a room where no lungs still worked. It was the only time in my life I truly felt fear in the presence of the dead. And the truth is, that fear never left me. It follows me still, like a shadow at my back, reminding me every time I step into a silent room that not everything we bury stays buried. Now I want to ask you, what do you think happened in that room? Was it just the tricks of an exhausted mind? Biology, gases and nerves playing cruel illusions in the dark? Or was it something else entirely? Something waiting in the space between life and death, something that doesn't want to be forgotten? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more true stories from inside the mortuary, stories of strange nights, unexplainable encounters, and the thin line between science and the supernatural, make sure to subscribe. There are many more stories to tell, and not all of them end peacefully.